Segment 4, Israel. Israel has this much of a border with Lebanon, this much of a border with Syria, but this much of a border with Egypt. You've just come back from Israel. What is the thinking in Israel about the meaning of this Arab Revolution for Israel?
Needless to say, the Israelis are very concerned. The wisest among the Israelis make clear that when people cry out for freedom and democracy, Israel should stand with them. But they also make clear, concerning the people in Egypt, that's a long-term aspiration. The path to freedom and democracy might be very bumpy for the Egyptians and very dangerous for the Israelis. In terms of actual threats, the Israelis don't fear conventional warfare. The army is close.
Tanks are not going to roll across the Sinai.
They're not going to roll across the Sinai. It's a long way across the desert, and those tanks are extremely vulnerable to the Israeli Air Force. However, so that is not a short-term or intermediate-term threat. What is the near-term threat is even worse security in the Sinai Peninsula than the security provided by Hosni Mubarak's regime. Every single missile and every single rocket, and there are now missiles in the Gaza Strip, Hamas-controlled Gaza Strip, they're real missiles, not crummy rockets, real missiles that can reach Tel Aviv, which you can aim, which explode in the air, which will kill hundreds or thousands of people. Every single armament in the Gaza Strip got there from Iran through the Sinai Peninsula. If the
smuggled in,
smuggled in illegally with the help of Bedouins, maybe Egyptian forces were bribed. Off, right. Yes, all of this. If this security breaks down even more, this is a tremendously significant threat to Israel. Moreover, it's not just Gaza. Israel, I think, as you already described, shares a long border, Sinai Peninsula. There's no force there. There's no security barrier there. There's a very serious threat of greater infiltration through the Sinai Peninsula into Israel. It's very worrisome from an Israeli point of view.
Victor?
Any time in history that you've had Syria and Egypt both bellicose, you've had a war with Israel, every time. The only reason we haven't had the same type of war is because Egypt was out of the picture. And I agree with Peter that we're not thinking of a 1967 or 73 war, but if one were to total up the missile arsenal of whether they're Katuskas or Scuds or whatever they are, and you count them in Lebanon and Shia-occupied Lebanon, in Syria, on the West Bank, controlled by Hamas in Gaza, and if you were to add to that equation on the Egyptian border, and then you were to look at the damage that suicide bombers did coming through Gaza, and you were to multiply that through terrorist bands coming in, insurgencies, things like that, you could really damage Israel as a sophisticated modern society very quickly by putting half the population in shelters and then having people come across the border, shoot people, commit acts of terrorism, not from one side, but from all sides. So that's what they're worried about, and they have reason to be, given their history.
In this roundup of what's taking place in the Arab nations, I didn't mention Syria, and I realize I didn't mention Syria because I haven't read much about Syria. What's taking place in Syria?
Well, officially, we're still making outreach. This new reset diplomacy started with the proposition that all our problems with Syria did not transcend George Bush. He started it. He was mean to them. He didn't have diplomatic relations to them. Barack Hussein Obama, as he said in his Al Arabiya interview, because of his father's religion and because of his multicultural fides, he was going to reach out to Syria, moderate its behavior. Nobody had ever tried that, he thought, although they had. And what's the result of that policy? We had to pressure Israel about settlements. We got nothing in turn from Syria, and now we're in this embarrassing situation where we're pressuring Mubarak on human rights, and a far greater offender, a regime, remember, whose father wiped out Hama, 10, 20,000 people slaughtered, was caught by the Israelis developing nuclear facilities, and we haven't said a word.
And there's no democracy movement in Syria.
Why isn't he next? Why don't we say? Why doesn't Barack Obama say, "Would you please step down, Mr. Assad"?
Peter, you've just come back from Israel. I've never been to Israel. I'm embarrassed to admit.
I have to bring you.
I'd love to visit. Over the last decade, roughly, correct my timing, as best I can tell, there have been two big trends. in Israel. One is tremendous economic buoyancy. That is a happening place. Lots of high technology, levels of education, the sense of simply leading a good life is everywhere to be seen. Trend one. Trend two. Things have gotten more and more and more dangerous. Iran in pursuit of nuclear weapons under a leader who has spoken openly about driving Israel into the sea. Turkish government becoming more Islamic and supporting that fleet of civilian ships that attempted to break the Gaza blockade. Now we have the victory of Hezbollah in Lebanon. We have now unrest and uncertainty in Egypt. The two Arab countries that have made peace, Egypt, government overturned. Jordan, king under pressure, let's put it that way. At a minimum, we have the king under pressure. I am reminded that all three of us know and admire him. We have our differences from him as well, but all three of us know and admire Christopher Hitchens.
Indeed.
And I am reminded that in his memoir, Hitch 22, he wrote that he could never quite bring himself to believe that Israel looked permanent. What about this sense, just looking at it objectively, doesn't one have the sense that the existential moment is approaching? How does Israel cope with that? I'm delighted to see that brings a smile to your face.
Yes, well, I wish I could tell you how they cope with it, where they find the fortitude. Of course, you see there is a kind of schizophrenia in Israel. As your description is absolutely right. Extraordinary prosperity. Tel Aviv and the greater Tel Aviv area has become one of the great Mediterranean beach towns that there is. At the same time, you hear a term among national security people and ordinary citizens that I didn't used to hear, and that is, and speaking about Iran, a threat to our very existence, an existential threat. All the previous wars, with the exception of the War of Independence, were fought outside Israel. One is very close to Israel, but urban areas, popular areas were not targeted. What's going to be different, and it already began to be different with the 2006 Second Lebanon War, is that all the enemies you mentioned, even Hamas, Hezbollah in the south, have real missiles, intermediate range missiles that will reach Tel Aviv. They will do terrible damage.